thank you for having me here. I feel like I've come full circle. So a lot of you know this, but not everyone knows this. I taught here from 2005 to 2010, and when I came on my interview, and a few of you have already had to hear this story, and my husband had to hear it earlier, but I came on my interview, and Dr. Johnson took me over to meet with President Carter, and we went into President Carter's office, and President Carter said, "Give me just a second, Laura. Chris and I need to talk about something real quick." And they start talking about this PD Literary Festival that they're excited about, that there's some funding for. And I said, "Ooh, if I come here, can I help?" And I came here and I got to help plan the first 4 years. So I was here helping to plan the first one in 2006 and onward until I left in 2010. I got to help contact writers. I had no clue what I was doing. I don't think any of us did, but we figured it out. And to come back as a writer is, this is everything. Like this just feels amazing. So I want to thank you all for inviting me. And Joangela and Landon and everybody else who has done work on this, I just want to thank you so much, because this is brilliant. This is my homecoming. Next week I'm going to read at West Virginia University, which is another sort of homecoming. So I feel like as my second book, I signed the contract on it Friday. So I feel like as this is happening, I am coming home again and again and again. So tonight I'm going to start by reading part of a story from Jaws of Life, my first book. Then I'm going to jump into part of my second book that's coming out in 2024, and then I'm going to jump back to this one. So, keep you on your toes a little bit. Just read some excerpts. So we're going to start actually with the first scene in Jaws of Life, the title story. "Where are we?" Iris asked. "You have a doctor's appointment," Harold said again. "Remember?" "Oh," she said, and stared into space. As the hospital elevator rose, Harold leaned back and closed his eyes. He was tired, but when they slowed to a stop, he stood upright. The reception desk faced the elevator, and Harold wondered if its placement was for patients who were sent up alone, their family members pushing a button and then taking a much-needed break. "Mrs. Travers," the nurse said. Iris didn't react. "That's us, sweetie," Harold said, and guided her out of the elevator. Not that he expected a reaction. Iris's moments of lucidity had seeped away, leaving a confused old woman who didn't recognize herself or anyone around her. "Can you keep an eye on her?" he asked the nurse. She peered at him. "Are you feeling okay, Mr. Travers?" "Fine," he said. "I'm fine. I forgot something in my truck. I'll be right back." When she nodded, he squeezed Iris's hand, but she didn't respond. He sighed. Iris looked like his wife, the woman who'd once picked him up from work and driven past their exit on the interstate, who'd continued driving all the way to the beach where they bought bathing suits and toothbrushes and spent a long weekend swimming and eating crab cakes. She looked like that woman, but she wasn't anymore. In the elevator, he told himself to stop, to go back. On his way to the truck, he convinced himself that he needed the paperback he'd left under the seat. Even sitting behind the wheel, he told himself to get out and return to his wife. Instead, Harold turned the key in the ignition, put the truck into drive, and inched toward the hospital's exit. On the road, he managed to tell himself that he was only taking a short drive, that Iris's appointment would last 30 minutes. As long as he was back by then, no one would ever know. Harold felt older than his 70 years. His joints ached and his eyes burned. It took him a few extra minutes to get up from a chair, and he hadn't been able to kneel in almost a decade. All he wanted was to fish on Saturdays and spend Sundays playing pinochle at the Elks. He wanted to watch TV in between naps and open his first beer at 3. Instead, he put combination locks on the inside of their doors and reminded Iris who he was, who she was. And for a long time, he didn't mind. He'd been more than willing to take care of Iris, to make sure her final years were painless. He'd even told her, right after her diagnosis, "I'm here until the very end." and he'd meant it. He had taken care of everything the first decade she was sick, and when she still had moments of lucidity, before she started calling Harold, Harold, every time he left her alone in a room. When he'd run back to reassure her, Iris didn't recognize him. She didn't know the man whose hair had long turned gray, whose eyes were lost in a sea of wrinkles, whose stomach lapped over his belt. She expected the man Harold had been, the one she'd married 30 years before when they'd both been young, not the old man he'd become. Of course, it had been months since Iris yelled for him, when she still remembered that she had a husband. Now he'd give anything for her to call out to him, even if it was only a memory of him. He and Iris had met at a support group for people who lost their spouses. Her first husband had had a stroke and died at the dinner table a few years before. 40's too young to die, she'd said, and Harold put his hand over hers. She smiled. After the meeting, they went out for coffee. As soon as they sat down, Harold said, "I'm not a widower." He explained that he'd never been married, hadn't been on a date in years, that a friend had told him he needed to meet a widow. And this is the only way I knew to meet one. You can't walk up to women on the street and ask if they're widows. But you're nice. My friend was right. He'd ignored the cup of coffee, but after his speech, Iris added sugar and milk into both their cups and stirred. She pushed one toward him and said, "Well, that's one I haven't heard before." And then she laughed, a deep belly laugh that made people turn and stare, a laugh so contagious that Harold chuckled too, until the whole situation became so absurd that they giggled until Harold's face hurt and Iris was gasping for breath. They were married 6 months later. Once, Harold had taken her to the Brickton Fair. He bought lemonade and a handful of tickets. He gave the tickets and a $50 bill to the ride operator. They rode the Ferris wheel for hours, only getting off when the fair began to shut down for the night. On the ground, they felt like they were still moving in slow circles. Iris said it was the best date ever, even if they were already married. After that, they went to any fair that came to the area, even if only to ride the Ferris wheel and leave. Harold still loved Ferris wheels, though he hadn't been on one in years. They belonged to his life with Iris. He pointed his truck toward the interstate, but he approached the on-ramp and drove past it. He merged with the traffic moving toward downtown Morgantown, the stop-and-go movement soothing to him at the moment. When he had to decide his next move, if he got on the interstate, he would keep going, past the exit for his house, through the mountains, until the hills petered out and he found himself on the shore. He wouldn't be able to stop. Behind the seat sat a bag with a change of clothes and a toothbrush. He kept it there for emergencies, like the night Iris had cut herself with a kitchen knife and had to get stitches. She'd been so agitated at the hospital that they'd sedated her and kept her overnight. Harold had slept by her bed and refilled his overnight bag the next day when they'd returned home. He'd needed it again when Iris got out of bed in the middle of a January night and walked down the street barefoot. He'd found her the next day, asleep under a child's swing in the park, her toes and cheeks frostbitten. They'd spent longer in the hospital then, and Iris had lost her pinky toe. That was when he put the combination locks on the front and back doors. Ahead, downtown Morgantown loomed, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by the university and suburbs. Harold crested the hill and slammed on the brakes. A line of cars was stopped just past the summit. The little Mazda behind him managed to stop without hitting him, its brakes squealing. But the truck behind it saw the stalled traffic too late. Frame jacked up, tires topping 4 feet, the truck climbed the rear of the little car and crushed the roof before coming to a complete stop. Harold watched in horror as the driver seemed to be crushed, the windshield buckling and bursting outward, the support beams bending until it was difficult to believe the car had ever been more than a flattened mess. I'm going to stop that one there. I know, it's kind of mean, but you never want to get too stuck in one story. So next, I am going to jump into chapter 2 of my novel a little bit. The current title is Everybody Has Something to Confess. I'm hoping the editor comes up with a better one because I keep forgetting it. And that's the problem. I keep saying, oh, no, this is the, oh, I forget. So, but we're jumping into chapter 2, and the story itself, the book is about the aftermath of a school shooting at a community college in rural West Virginia. And in chapter 1, we actually see the shooting itself, and the shooter comes into this classroom, and the story is told from 4 perspectives throughout the book. So we switch between these 4 perspectives, and there are 4 people who were in that final classroom. And when you do training for school shooting, at least when I did it in 2015, they teach you not to hide, because if you hide, somebody comes in and just shoots everyone. They teach you to run if you can, and if you can't, to fight back. And I remember they told us, this was the Furman police, which we call FUPO. Well, FUPO told us, they said, if you're planning for this, you should really make a plan in your classroom, and you should go to the students and actually say, who volunteers? Like, I volunteer to take the right arm. I volunteer to take the right leg. I volunteer to stick my thumbs in their eyes. I mean, it's horrifying. And I woke up that night, and this book showed up, and I started writing it. I woke up in the middle of the night, walked to the bar in the middle of my house, and wrote longhand a few pages, and then went back to bed. And it took a while to finish it, years. But the beginning of the story in chapter 1, these 4 people are the 4 who run forward. There's not a plan. They run forward, and in disarming the shooter, they actually kill him. And the question becomes, are we heroes? How do we live with ourselves after this event? The second chapter is told from the point of view of Charlie. When we start this chapter, where we're starting in the chapter, Charlie has learned before this that the shooter was actually a friend of his childhood friend, Wayne. And Wayne was in his classroom, and he recognized him. He doesn't realize until afterward, but he knew what he was doing. And Charlie is actually running to the home, like jogging to the home of Wayne's mother. He feels really guilty about what he's done. This kid was his friend, and he's jogging to her house and kind of remembering this childhood friendship he had with Wayne. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. And there are a couple, just to warn you, there are a couple details from the shooting. I don't get super grisly, but I take no offense if anyone needs to step out, but I purposely am not reading the actual stuff from chapter 1. Charlie stopped at the end of Maple Avenue, propped his hands on his knees, and closed his eyes. He heaved once, but nothing came up. He stood, wiped strings of spittle from his lips, and stepped into the street. Small, identical houses lined the road, evidence that Brickton was an old coal town with company roots. The houses had become more run down in the decades since he'd last been here. Almost no space existed between them. Cracked asbestos siding in need of a paint job left most looking forgotten. Once the company and its stores were gone, people often began making the houses their own, adding a bay window or attaching a garage. Here, people hadn't bothered adding those individual touches. Besides the occasional lawn ornament, the houses all looked like they had 100 years ago. He realized too late he should have looked up the address. He'd assumed cameras would be trained on the house, reporters speaking into microphones, community members capturing the moment with cell phones. But apparently Wayne's name hadn't been released publicly yet. 2/3 of the way down the street, Charlie recognized the house where he'd grown up. No different from the others, but when the city had poured a new sidewalk out front, he and Wayne had done what all kids do and carved their initials along the edge. They'd taken a butter knife from Charlie's kitchen but hadn't washed it off afterward. Later, his mom had found it in the sink, concrete hardened along its edges. He hadn't denied what they'd done, though he'd told her it was Wayne's idea. Charlie had walked too far. The house was on the opposite side of the street. Crossing over, he spied it up ahead, a birdhouse 10 years ago perched between the front windows. Now only a few pieces of wood clung to the siding. The house was dark except for a bluish light flickering through a window. Television. Charlie climbed the porch steps and knocked before he could talk himself out of it. He heard nothing from inside. Then, clearly, the thump, thump, thump of footsteps. The door opened an inch, one eye visible beneath the safety chain. Wayne's mom. "I don't know if you remember me," he said into the crack. She didn't react. "I used to live down the street." Still no response. "Wayne and I were friends." She cocked her head to the side. "Charlie Folger?" The crack widened. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Buckley closed the door, unlatched the chain, then threw it open, arms wide. She hugged him, swaying back and forth. The smell of booze clung to her, the light scent of alcoholic perfume. "Charlie." She held him at arm's length. "I was hoping some of Wayne's friends would come. You're the first." She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. He was thrown back in time. The beat-up brown couch still dominated the tiny living room. The scuffed coffee table was even more scratched. An uncomfortable armchair no one ever used still sat neglected in a corner. Everything was disheveled. Drawers upturned, piles of paper scattered, fingerprint powder on a few surfaces. "Excuse the mess," she said. "Police ripped this place apart looking for God knows what. Like my boy could have." She grabbed a stack of papers, tapped them against the table to straighten their corners, and put them down again, though they were still in disarray. As though there were anything. She shook her head, pressed her fingers to her lips. "You should see Wayne's room. They took half of it with them, left a damn mess of the rest." She raised her chin, added, "Once they accused Wayne. I told them to get out of my house. They said I was making it harder than it had to be. Damn right I am." Her lips were pursed, her chin quivered. Charlie looked at the pictures on the wall, all of them slightly askew. Wayne through middle and high school, a picture of him and Mrs. Buckley wearing identical grins. Him in a high school graduation gown, her wearing his mortarboard. A shot of him in his BCC garb, Brickton Community College. A t-shirt and a ball cap, maybe the same ones he'd been wearing today. "He's a handsome boy." She paused. He was a handsome boy. She peered at the photos. He was growing into a real good man. That flicker of anger again. Charlie couldn't speak, didn't know what to say, so he kept staring at the photos. He was cooling off, his sweat drying through, though his clothes were now cold and damp. He shivered. "Let me get you something to warm you up." Mrs. Buckley grabbed him by the shoulders and steered him to the couch. She was a tiny woman with sad eyes and flushed cheeks, but her grip was firm. She went into the kitchen and Charlie settled in. He looked around as though being here would clarify some element of Wayne's character, explain why he'd killed all those people. None did. Still, details were coming back. The wood-paneled walls, the scent of baby powder on Mrs. Buckley's skin, the underlying odor of cigarettes. Charlie had always assumed those details belonged to his own house. Now he wondered how much of his childhood he'd spent here. Mrs. Buckley returned, handed him a jelly jar filled with an inch of liquor. Charlie had expected coffee or tea, but took the glass just the same. She sat beside him, held up her glass, and said, "To Wayne." Charlie held his up, but didn't repeat the toast. She clinked their glasses together and then swallowed the liquor in one gulp. Charlie sipped at his, not sure what to expect. It was sickly sweet, almost medicinal. Still, it warmed his throat and stomach. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were in his class." "He did?" She nodded. "Wayne came home after that first day all excited. He said you looked just the same." She stared at him. "You do. Older, of course, but you're still the kid who stole all of Wayne's Halloween candy." "I did? When you put all the bad candy you'd gotten in his bag and left with the good stuff?" He shook his head. He didn't remember ever trick-or-treating. His mind was oddly blank when it came to life before West Brickton. Maybe a defense mechanism. Already, Charlie's house felt warmer, more welcoming than the trailer ever had. He could picture kids playing on the sidewalks out front, had vague memories of being one of them. "Wayne asked me if I remembered throwing rocks at those girls up the street," Charlie said. Mrs. Buckley smiled. "He pinged one right in the head," he said. "They weren't allowed to play with us after that." Her smile disappeared. "I remember that. The rock hit her just behind the ear and she bled like a stuck pig. You were both grounded for a week after that. Wayne thought he was too old, but I whipped him good that night. You were playing the same as ever a few days later. Charlie shook his head, wasn't sure whose memory to believe. She went into the kitchen and returned with a photo album and a mostly empty bottle. She topped off his drink, though he hadn't finished what was already there. She added a few inches to her own glass and plopped onto the couch beside him. She opened the photo album. They started with baby Wayne in some man's arm, presumably Wayne's father. A few of Mrs. Buckley, the man, and Wayne. Most of Wayne grinning at the camera with drool on his chin, with one tooth jutting from his lower jaw, holding a toy truck. In each one, baby Wayne grew a little older, and eventually Charlie joined him. The two of them on their bikes in front of the house. In Wayne's room wearing only t-shirts and underwear. On the porch covered in head to toe in mud. They'd been better friends than Charlie remembered. Here was clear evidence he and Wayne had been like brothers, wearing identical outfits, setting up a tent in a yard barely large enough for it, 2 birthday cakes side by side with him and Wayne behind them grinning broadly. Charlie wasn't sure how he'd managed to forget a relationship that had clearly been so dear, maybe because he had no visual reminders of his own. His mom wasn't the type to take pictures. She'd had a few photos of her and Charlie around the trailer, a few of just Charlie. Over the years, she'd put up snapshots of her and different boyfriends. The most recent ones had been of Ed, the guy she'd gone with to Texas. They'd filled his car with their clothes, the TV, a few other small trinkets. "The rest is yours," she'd said, sweeping her arms wide, as though the trailer contained treasures. Here, Charlie saw his childhood as he'd never seen it before, happy and loved. His mom wasn't bad. They'd always had enough to eat. The trailer was comfortable if small, and he never really wanted for anything. But she'd never been much interested in him either. The more he saw of Mrs. Buckley's pictures, the worse Charlie felt. His stomach churned when he saw him and Wayne with their arms around each other's necks, grinning, wearing the same outfit. Mrs. Buckley ran her finger across the picture. The last week of 4th grade. She was beginning to slur her words. "A few days before you and your mom moved." And Charlie suddenly remembered that day when he and Wayne had burst into his house to find his mom surrounded by boxes, half their kitchen already packed. His mom had been smiling. She'd wrapped her arms around him, half lifting him off the ground. "We're leaving this shithole, baby," she'd said. At first, he didn't know what she was talking about. He stared up at her, backpack still on his shoulders. Wayne stood beside the front door. "They accepted our offer on the trailer," she said. She looked so excited that he nodded along. "That's great, Mom." "I already called the school. You don't have to go the rest of this week. You'll start fresh at Falwell Middle in the fall." "Falwell?" He glanced back at Wayne, who had the screen door open, one foot on the porch. "Of course, silly." She ruffled his hair. "It's closer to the trailer." Falwell, the name of the next town over, not Brickton, not the kids he'd grown up with, not Wayne. But his mom was never this happy, and she never ruffled his hair, never hugged him. He wrapped his arm around her waist, and she swung him back and forth. When he turned back around, Wayne had left. The next day, his mom's boyfriend of the month showed up with a truck. Charlie knocked on Wayne's door, but Mrs. Buckley shook her head and said Wayne wasn't feeling well. Charlie left, never having said goodbye. The next time he remembered seeing Wayne was in Mrs. Freeman's class. Mrs. Freeman is the teacher from Chapter 1. "Did you or my mom ever try to get us together?" he asked. "Once." She turned to him. "Your mom dropped you off here a week or so after you moved. Wayne locked himself in his room and refused to come out. You sat on the couch watching cartoons until your mom came back. Why didn't you try again?" "I was busy. Wayne played with other kids on the street." She shrugged. "You disappeared from his life, but he was okay." She turned the page in the album, and Charlie saw that he really had disappeared. Wayne stood beside his mom in one shot, surrounded by other kids Charlie vaguely remembered, more shots with kids he'd never seen before. Then Wayne was in high school, pimples dotting his forehead, some shots with his mom, one or two with other kids, but Charlie noticed Wayne was alone in more and more of the photos. No one but him and his mom in the final pages. The look on Wayne's face grew more serious as he got older until the smile in the final photo looked almost obscene. When they reached an empty page, Mrs. Buckley pressed her palm against it and closed her eyes, her head bowed. "I have to tell you something," Charlie said, pulling his eyes away from the page that would always remain empty. He grabbed the glass of amber liquid and gulped its contents. His gut burned with the alcohol and too many emotions to name. She nodded and squeezed his hand. He took a deep breath. "I'm not sure if you know this yet, but Wayne died in our classroom." She didn't seem to understand and drew her eyebrows together. He cleared his throat, wished he had more alcohol. Class had just started, and we were getting into groups when we heard gunshots and screams from the hallway. He didn't want to be the one to tell her, but he didn't want anyone else to either. He forced his way into the room. We didn't know it was Wayne. She nodded and pulled her hand from his to wipe her eyes. She put her hand on his cheek, a caress, and he knew she didn't understand, that he had to make her understand. "We killed him." He cleared his throat again, felt sick. "I was the one who killed him, one of the ones who killed him." He paused, remembered the pencil, the blood gushing from Wayne's neck. There were details she didn't need to know, ones he hoped she never knew. "I helped kill him." Mrs. Buckley put her hand over her mouth. Charlie hurried on, describing how dark the room was, how scared they all were. His anger returned when he described the bullets hitting Sutter. He didn't mention Priscilla's pointy shoes or Mrs. Freeman's nails. He didn't mention the pencil. He lingered on how he'd peed his pants. His voice caught when he described joining the others. He stared at his lap as he spoke. Occasionally he glanced up, but her face was turned from him. He described the moment he realized Wayne wasn't breathing. All her tears had dried, and her cheeks were more flushed than they had been. She stood. Charlie remained seated. He bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he said, even though it was only a fraction of what he felt. "No," she said loudly, "you don't get to be sorry." She dug her nails into his bicep, hard enough that Charlie wanted to yell out. He let her pull him up. She marched him across the room toward the front door. She opened the storm door, pushed him through it, and latched it. Charlie stared through the screen. Her nostrils flared, her eyes bright. "I didn't know it was Wayne," he whispered. "I wouldn't have done it if I'd known." But he would have. That much he knew. She stared at him. He remained still. He waited for her to slam the door in his face, extinguish the lights. Instead, she said, "You killed my boy." She sounded sad, resigned. She started to swing the door closed. "But I don't understand why I had to," he said. She froze, her hand wrapped around the door's edge, her knuckles white. "Can I come back?" His heart hammered as he waited for her response. She closed her eyes, rubbed her temples, then dropped her hand and looked at him again. She nodded and then closed the door softly. The deadbolt clicked, but the light remained on. So I'm going to end that one there. A little dark, I know. Apologies, but I kind of write dark stuff. And like 2 more minutes just to lighten the mood a little bit. I'm going to read the first scene from Frackers, the very first story in Jaws of Life. Hydraulic fracturing is the practice of getting natural gas from ground deposits, and it destroys the landscape. And there are giant pockets of natural gas in north central West Virginia, and I'm watching my home be ruined. I have family who have become millionaires on doing this work, and even my dad, he said, "I don't own the mineral rights to my land," and he just kind of has to deal with things and try to get what money he can. It's also a really poor state. So if you're poor and you can get land and you can get some money, you do. And one night I was there and I wanted to write about fracking, but you can't write fracking is bad. So I was driving with my family, and we were going out to visit my great aunt and uncle, and in the middle of nowhere, and we rounded this bend in the road, and these giant industrial-sized light bulbs blinded my mom, who almost ran off the road. She slammed on the brakes. We crawled through. We were fine. But suddenly I found out how to write my fracking story. So I'm going to tell you, just start with this first little scene. Frackers. Picture it. 4 industrial bulbs, 1,000 plus watts each, trained on the house all night. And it doesn't matter if I use blackout curtains or move to another room. There's no way to ignore the production happening just a quarter mile from my bedroom window. I can hear the workers yelling, the whine of machinery, the wrecks that sometimes happen because drivers are confused by the brightness. I can see the lights through closed eyelids. When you're looking at a check full of zeros for just a few acres of land, you think about a new roof, replacing the furnace that hasn't kept the house properly warm in at least 10 years. You think about how you won't have to pinch pennies until the beginning of the next month. You don't think about the fact that fracking is a 24-hour business, or that they'll point their lights straight at your bedroom window, then claim it's the only angle that works. For 6 months, I called Jamison Wells, the county, the state, anyone I could get on the phone. Everywhere I turned, I received the same stony silence. So I got out of bed one night at midnight and slid off my nightgown, replacing it with black pants and shirt, black shoes, my white hair tied up under a black hat. They wouldn't see me coming. I crouched behind trees and crawled across the field on my elbows, a serious undertaking for a woman my age. About 50 yards off, I lay on the ground and caught my breath. Then I pulled the BB gun off my back and aimed for center mass. There was a small ping and then a tinkle of broken glass as the first bulb burst. The men hadn't figured out what was going on before I'd shattered 2 more. I never got a chance with the final bulb. They'd realized what was happening and turned the light from my line of sight. As their voices filled the night air, I crawled back to my house and slid into my bed without anyone realizing I'd been gone. It was the soundest I'd slept in months. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I am more than happy to answer, and James is going to come around with the microphone.
Hi. I was just curious how much time had passed in the second story you read about the school shooting, between the shooting and him going to see her mother.
That was the same night. So the shooting happens in the morning, and he ends up running to her house that same night.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that was a detail I should have shared, but yeah. Most of the book takes place over about 2 weeks, and then we go maybe for about another month by the end of the book. So it's very much the immediate aftermath when the media is still there, and then right after they leave, and you have to look around and go, what happens now? Like, what do we do when the cameras are gone? Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Since you wrote a collection of short stories, how did you decide which order to place them in? Because we do have, if I'm remembering correctly, some characters who cross stories but aren't directly associated with each other all the time. How did you decide to put these stories in the order that you did? And was there a thematic purpose?
There was not a thematic purpose, but so it's in and around the same town of Brickton, West Virginia. And then I thought about some stories where I'd have a character show up, so I'd want to not have them in the same part of the book. There are 2 stories that are told in the first person plural, and I didn't want those in the same part of the book, so one's at the very beginning, one's at the very end. And then I wanted to sprinkle through some of my favorites. So I have Frackers has always been my favorite, it's the one that hits closest to home. So, and I'm not sure it's still my favorite, but when I wrote the book it was, so I put it first. And then Photographing the Dead comes at the end because I also just really liked that one because it was a cool story. Jaws of Life kind of in the middle since it was the title. So I really did think about it, but it was both what was each story doing, what characters show up, and what characters don't show up, and which ones. Fun side note, not quite related to that. One of the characters who shows up in Frackers is one of the main characters in the novel, and then it all takes place in the same town. So I'm kind of like, Ben was talking earlier about building like a whole universe that you could keep writing from, and I think yours is a lot bigger of an idea than mine, but I'm kind of creating these towns, this region in north central West Virginia that's based on where I'm from, but this world that I can write within all of these different stories, so yeah.
Since you said that, the question may make more sense or have more relevance, because I was thinking of the Ninth Medal when you were talking about fracking, because you lead us into thinking of a small town boom where everyone just starts to come in and making money the best way they can. You talk about mineral rights in your Omniverse or wherever you're calling that. I was going there first. But I didn't know if you wanted to name it after yourself or after the medal that they're going for. But Percyverse sounds good. I'm going to have to say that with a straight face a couple of times, but I'll practice it. But yeah, you make me think of the same things of what will you do for that money? I asked my students that when we talked about your stories of what would you do for $1 million? What would you do? They would say, no, they wouldn't do that. And I said, I don't believe you. I'm glad you said that, that this is all taking place in the same area, because then going to the darker part of it was really moved. Obviously, I think a lot of us were moved by you're talking about the school shooting, and we are part of the academic universe who has to go through or has at one time heard about the training, and I'm curious about what kind of uncomfortable stuff you had to go through with doing the research for this story as well, or the novel.
I do. So I try to do enough research to get the story and then get a few drafts down before I move on, because I don't want to build on other people's stories. I want this to be a new story. I look things up as necessary. I kind of like, what is the gun that is used in most school shootings? An AR-15, I learned very quickly. So I have those sorts of details, but then later I start reading all the books I can. I start reading plays, I start reading poems, I start looking at pictures, listening to podcasts, listening to NPR, things, and just as much as I can to get the details. Like, you don't think about, so something I learned by doing some research later by listening to a few things on NPR and reading a few things is, you know how people put like teddy bears outside of school shootings? Like, those have to go somewhere. And then there's the question of where do they go, and sometimes they're sent straight to the dumpster. Other times, like, there are other places where there are like museums of like the trinkets that are left. So just those small details that show up, and it's like, what does happen to those things? Who are the people who show up? Like, there's a prayer bus. There are parents who lost their child to a school shooting who show up now. Like, they take their own RV to all of the school shootings and they help people before they move on to the next one, because there's always a next one. And learning these details kind of create that sense of reality in this thing that feels unreal because it should feel unreal. That sort of violence should feel unreal. So I always use research kind of after the fact and then start building things into the story. But I start with the people. I care about the people more than anything, and who are these people, and what's driving them, and how do you survive? And I care about these people I grew up with, who I've kind of grown away from, but I've known, and I'm still related to, and I still visit. So yeah.
Does your novel deal with an Alex Jones type character, or that sort of?
I did not get into that. There were a lot of decisions I had to make about what comes into it, what doesn't, and I did not want that blowhard. It would change. It would change how these people do or do not heal, and how they can or cannot move on. And I'm not sure that an Alex Jones sort of person allows any sort of moving on or even thinking about it early on. So yeah, the sad thing is the world of school shootings is so full that I can't include everything because there's just too much. Mm-hmm.
Hello again. Hi.
Hi.
How do you take care of yourself when you're writing such emotionally devastating stories? You mentioned earlier that you write a lot of really heavy things. How do you help yourself write that story but also take care of your own mental space?
I don't do this at night. So some people saying like I'm a night owl. I don't do this at night. I spend my evenings with my family. I have a 16-month-old who is just, he's adorable. Like, I made him. He looks nothing like me. He's just the cutest thing I've ever. But I spend a lot of time getting hugs from my son. I really do try to pay attention to the people within the awful, because even the book I'm working on now, the other day when I was like, okay, I need to wrap this up. I'm traveling for the next week, and I wrote this horrifying scene in chapter 1, surprise again. But it's about the people, and if I keep focusing on the people and saying these are real people who really I care about them, that's how I take care of me. I care about the people more than the events. I want to see how they survive and hopefully thrive post-horror show. It's about the aftermath. None of my books or stories end with the awful thing. I'm not leading toward the awful thing. I want to see how people come out of it, and I want to see where they can go forever changed, sometimes horribly, but I try to end with that sense of hope, and I think it's the hope in the human stories that help me, and the baby. Baby hugs always help everything. Yeah, and before I had my baby, most of my friends have babies, so I could go hug their babies, and that also helps. It doesn't even have to be your baby. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why don't you include your time here at Francis Marion in your bio?
I know. I need to. I need to go back to, I think Landon pulled this from my website, and I need to go back and build it out and be like, West Virginia University, Francis Marion University. Because here, so I did the prison work a little bit at West Virginia University, and here I still felt the permission to talk about it and to do that research. And I did a lot of writing here, and I was kind of figuring out who I was. I was 25 when I came here, and it was my first academic job. And I feel like I found a lot of who I needed to be. I needed to leave here at the end of those 5 years to take the next step, but I feel like this place was really seminal in my being who I am now. And I think a lot of students and faculty who come through here feel that you come back to Francis Marion, and it's like this place helps you. It helps you figure things out. And I'm driving through town and going, all of this is different. And I'm telling people, as we were driving out this morning we were driving out here, and I was trying to remember who I've had in my car when, and we're driving out here, and I'm like, and this, here was my gym, and I remember after dark they had to escort us out to our cars, but I also remember I remember that gym was kind of a life-saving place for me. My therapist here was like, you need to go take this yoga class at this gym, and it was the beginning of my yoga career, and I still practice. Not as much as I should, but I'm going to remedy that, Lynn. Thank you very, very much. Yes, it needs to happen. Because
I think you should.
I think I should too, because Francis Marion is that place. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any last questions? Or do we end on Francis Marion as that place? One more, okay.
I've been trying to figure out how to ask this correctly. When you do a realistic fiction book, you have to, do research to pick the details. How do you not get overwhelmed with all the details that you find? And how do you pick and choose which ones you want to put in your story?
Ooh, that's a good question. I try to add, does it fit in the story? Like, that's part of it. Recently, I listened to another podcast about school shootings, because there's always one. And there were so many great details in there, but it was as I was wrapping the book up and getting ready to send it out, and I was just like, some of this just doesn't fit. It's what are the details that actually fit within my story and within the world of these characters. Like an Alex Jones character doesn't fit this time. People asked about gun control before, like, does gun control make it into your story? That doesn't make it into this story. This story is about, I have to think, what do my characters want, and how can those details help to bring out their wants? And others I tuck away, because all of those details are great, and I might be able to use them someday in a different project. I hope not to write about school shootings again. Like, I'm hoping like this is the one and done, but you never know where like a really good detail might be important later, so I always just have it tucked into a different document, into a piece of paper in my back pocket that I might find later. I need a darkroom closet like Ben was describing earlier with all the details so that I can start keeping them there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, I want to thank you all for being here. This was awesome. I really appreciate you, and thanks for listening to my stories.